The gunshot rang out across the empty street just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, and somewhere behind the row of abandoned houses, a scream tore through the quiet like a blade through silk, sharp and raw and full of something ancient, fear, maybe, or grief too heavy for one soul to carry alone. The old man fell to his knees on the cracked sidewalk, his hand clutching the air where someone used to stand, where something warm and breathing had just been, and in that space, silent now except for the faint ringing in his ears and the echo of the gunfire, there was only the dog left, her ribs heaving, her eyes wide, her coat matted with dirt and time and stories no one ever cared enough to ask about. That dog, no name, no collar, no home but the shadow she followed, stood still as stone as the man began to cry in a way men of his generation were taught never to cry, not in war, not in peace, not even when the world takes everything and leaves you with silence. No one saw who fired the shot, but the damage was done, someone was gone, someone who mattered, and now all that was left was the broken man, the loyal dog, and a question that had no answer, at least not yet: why here? Why now? The German shepherd took a step forward, her gaze never leaving the alley from where the shot had come, and for the briefest of moments, the man could swear he saw understanding in her eyes, like she knew more than she should, like she had seen this play out before, somewhere else, in another life, or maybe just in the dark corners of this one. She didn't bark. She didn't chase. She just turned her head back to him, and in that glance was the beginning of something neither of them would dare to name, an unspoken agreement, a vow not made with words but with bone and breath and that quiet kind of sorrow that settles in the body like dust in old wood. They didn't speak, not that first night when the ambulance came and the officers took their notes and whispered behind their hands like the world couldn't hear them, like pain didn't have ears of its own, like memory didn't sit in the corner waiting to pounce when the room grew still. Later, when the door of the man's small house closed behind him and the silence became unbearable again, the dog walked in like she'd always lived there, like she already knew where the floor creaked and where the furnace coughed in winter, and she lay down by the fireplace without asking permission, because some souls don't need to ask, they just belong. He didn't feed her that first night, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to be needed anymore, didn't know how to start caring again after so many years of making sure his heart stayed locked behind quiet mornings and the kind of routine that numbs you without you noticing. But when the dawn came and the light fell across her face, he found himself at the stove, cooking bacon for two, and he didn't understand why he was crying into the pan until much later, when the sound of her tail thumping against the floor reminded him what it felt like to be chosen by something that asked nothing in return. He never told her his name, but she found it anyway, somehow, in the way she tilted her head when he muttered it to himself over coffee, and before long, she was responding to Annie, because that's what he called her when the loneliness got too loud to ignore, and sometimes names are less about what they mean and more about what they rescue you from. Weeks passed, and though neither of them spoke, at least not with words, there was conversation in the way she walked beside him on the morning rounds, in the way she pressed her body to his leg when the wind picked up and the memories came back like ghosts banging on locked doors, begging to be let in. One evening, just as he was locking up the hardware store he still ran out of habit more than necessity, a boy no older than 16 came to the counter, trembling, looking behind him like someone was chasing shadows only he could see, and he didn't say a word until Annie walked out from the back, her head low, her eyes cautious but calm. And then the boy said something that neither the man nor the dog expected, something that made the room feel colder than it should have been, even with the fire going. That's her. That's the dog. I saw her the night my brother disappeared. The old man stood still, his hands trembling slightly, not from age this time, but from something deeper, something like dread wrapped in disbelief, something that made the moment stretch like a held breath waiting to be broken. He wanted to say the boy was mistaken, that there were 1,000 German shepherds in this state alone, that memories play tricks, especially in the dark, especially when grief gets tangled up in guilt and turns into something heavier than truth. But Annie didn't move. She just looked at the boy with a stillness that didn't feel like fear or guilt, but something harder to name, maybe recognition, maybe resignation, and the man felt it deep in his bones, something was unraveling, and it had started long before the gunshot in the alley. The boy, his name was Caleb, though Jack wouldn't learn that until later, pulled a photograph from his jacket, edges bent, corners worn, and laid it down like a truth too long buried. In the grainy image, washed in the yellow of cheap streetlight, stood Annie, same frame, same haunted eyes, same scar just beneath her left ear, frozen in time outside the parking lot of Miller's grocery, standing just feet away from a young man being forced into the back seat of a dark sedan. That photo, blurred and faded as it was, hit Jack harder than any rifle ever had, because suddenly he realized he didn't really know the dog sleeping at his feet each night, didn't know what weight she carried, didn't know where she went in her dreams when she whimpered against the floorboards like something was still chasing her. The boy sat down across from him, not saying a word, not moving a muscle, just staring at the dog who might have seen the last moment of his brother's life. Jack picked up the photo with unsteady fingers, looked once more at the eyes he thought he knew, then leaned forward, voice softer than it had been in years, and asked. "So, where did you see her? I mean, what place exactly?" "She was standing right at the corner of Blackstone Quarry Road," the boy said, his voice quiet but certain, like someone remembering something they wish they could forget. "Just across from Miller's grocery. I swear it." The words landed between them with the weight of something old and unfinished, something that had been waiting years to be believed, and Jack felt the hair on his arms rise, not from fear exactly, but from that deep and ancient feeling that says you're not imagining it anymore. He looked at Annie, who hadn't moved since the photo hit the counter, her eyes locked on the boy with a silence that didn't ask for permission, only patience, and in that stillness Jack felt something stir, the way a man feels the air change before a storm breaks open over his roof. Caleb reached back into his coat and pulled out a folded paper map, torn at the edges, stained from weather and use, and pointed to a spot just outside the edge of the old industrial zone, near the woods where Blackstone Quarry had long ago stopped digging but never stopped burying. Jack hadn't been down that road in more than 20 years, there wasn't anything left down there except rust, rot, and the kind of silence that makes men turn their collars up and walk a little faster without realizing why. "She was there," Caleb said again, this time louder, firmer, like saying it out loud might push back against the disbelief crawling across Jack's face. "She was barking like crazy, trying to pull at the door of that car, but nobody listened." Jack sat down slowly behind the counter, his knees stiff, his breath caught halfway between a curse and a prayer, and stared at Annie, whose eyes now flicked toward him with something almost like apology. "You're sure it was her?" he asked, already knowing the answer before the words left his mouth, because doubt was the only thing standing between him and a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. Caleb didn't even blink. "That scar," he said, pointing gently to the nick beneath Annie's ear, "my brother reached for her when they dragged him away. I remember watching his fingers disappear under the car door, and then I saw blood on her neck. She fought like hell, but it didn't matter." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the window like the past trying to get in, and Jack felt a pressure building in his chest, not grief, not yet, but something colder, something more demanding, like unfinished business clawing its way through time. He walked to the front of the shop, opened the door, and stared down Main Street, empty now, quiet, but echoing with footsteps that no longer belonged to the living. Annie followed, standing beside him without sound, without explanation, just presence, and that presence, Jack realized, was heavier than anything he'd carried in a long time. Back inside, Caleb unfolded the rest of the map and traced a path with his finger from Blackstone Road to the burned-out edge of the old Blackstone textile mill, a place Jack hadn't thought of since long before his hands started trembling in the cold. "I followed her," the boy said. "4 weeks. Every town, every place someone said they saw a shepherd wandering alone. She led me here." Jack turned around slowly, the weight of it all pulling at his spine like gravity had just gotten stronger, and sat back down at the counter, his voice low and tired. "So this ain't random. Her showing up here, in this store, it's not just luck, is it?" Caleb shook his head. "No, sir. She brought me here. She always knew where to go." Jack rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, the photo still lying beside him, staring up with the awful stillness of memory captured too late. Then Caleb added something Jack wasn't ready for, not in the moment, not in this lifetime. "They trained her, you know, before all this. Before she ran." Jack raised his head slowly, the word trained echoing in his ears like a leftover from another world, and asked. Wait, trained her for what? Not as a pet, Caleb said, his voice low and steady, as if he were reciting something he'd been carrying for too long in silence, as a witness. They used her like a camera that never forgets. Jack stared at the boy for a long moment, unsure whether to feel horror or awe, because suddenly everything, the bark at the passing van, the haunted eyes, the stillness she carried like a wound, made an awful kind of sense. Caleb reached into his jacket again and unfolded a crumpled document, the kind of paper that had passed through too many hands and seen too many nights under cheap motel lamps and rain-soaked dashboards. It was thin and half-faded, but the blacked-out lines and the stamped seal in the corner made Jack's chest tighten. She was part of something they called the Behavioral Asset Program, Caleb explained, laying the sheet across the counter. They took working dogs, trained them to identify patterns, faces, voices, things most people forget in a minute, she remembers forever. Jack looked at Annie, who hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't shifted her gaze from the boy since he started speaking. Something about her stillness now felt less like calm and more like attention, full, focused, unwavering attention, like she was waiting for permission to unlock a part of herself she'd buried deep. Caleb hesitated, then added, they used her for extractions. She was there when it went bad, when my brother was taken. She tried to stop it. Jack's fingers curled tightly against the edge of the counter, and for a long time he said nothing at all, only listened to the wind scratching at the front door and the quiet hum of the fluorescent light above them. Then he asked, with a voice weighed down by something that had no name yet, and all this time, you've been following her? Caleb nodded. I followed rumors. People said a shepherd wandered through towns, quiet, alert, like she was searching for something. Or someone. Outside, the evening light had faded to that dull steel gray that makes everything feel older and colder than it is. Jack flipped the sign on the door to closed, then turned back toward Annie. She was already standing, ears forward, tail still, staring at the boy like she knew the road ahead and had just been waiting for someone to walk it with her. Jack sighed, deep and shaky, then reached under the counter and pulled out a set of keys from a small rusted tin labeled spare. I've got one that opens the old gate behind Blackstone, he said. If she's going back, we'd best follow. They left quietly, without a word to anyone, walking the old dirt road past the faded barns and the sagging power lines, their boots crunching the gravel while Annie trotted slightly ahead, nose to the wind, her body tensing as the woods thickened around them. The mill came into view just as dusk turned to dark, its jagged silhouette jutting from the trees like a wound no one ever cleaned, the windows blackened, the walls scarred by time and fire. Annie slowed her pace and walked up the crumbling concrete steps as if they were familiar, as if she'd walked them before in a different life, with different people beside her. Inside, the air was damp and sour, filled with the smell of rotted wood, rusted steel, and something else, fainter, colder, almost like fear soaked into stone. She moved to the far side of the structure, stopping in front of what used to be the foreman's office, now just a shallow pit of broken beams and collapsed flooring, and began to paw at the dirt with calm, practiced strokes. Jack knelt beside her, brushing back dust and soot, until his fingers struck something hard and plastic beneath the surface, a torn backpack, faded and split at the seams, with a cell phone still zipped into the outer pouch. Caleb dropped to his knees as Jack handed it over, and when the boy saw the initials burned into the rubber casing, he closed his eyes and whispered his brother's name like it had been caught in his throat for a year. But Annie wasn't finished. She stepped past the wreckage and toward the far corner of the room, where something metal glinted faintly beneath the ash and broken tiles. Jack followed her and dug gently until he pulled free a dog tag, scratched, bent, but still legible. Ranger. Below it, a phone number. Jack stared at the number, heart sinking. It was an old one, but it was from his hometown. From the very county where he'd grown up, raised his son, buried his wife. And now that number was hanging around the neck of the dog who'd walked back into his life like she'd never left it. He turned to Annie, voice barely audible, the words heavier than any he'd spoken in years. You didn't just find me by chance, did you? She didn't move. She just stared toward the broken window on the far wall, her ears slowly tilting toward a sound only she had noticed. That's when Jack heard it too. Faint. Mechanical. Steady. An engine, rolling slow over gravel. He stepped carefully to the window and looked out. There, just beyond the gate they'd come through, was a black sedan, idling in the trees with its lights off. It didn't move. The engine stayed on. Then the driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out in a dark coat, his movements calm, his face in shadow beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching the mill, like a man waiting for something, or someone, to come out. Jack ducked back quickly, heart pounding in his ears, and turned toward Annie. But before he could speak, a sound rose from the floor behind them. A small voice. Hoarse. Faint. Real. Help me, please, I'm still here. Jack stared at the floorboards. Then at Annie. His voice cracked as he whispered. Did you hear that too? Like something ancient had snapped into place inside her chest, she darted toward the far side of the room, nose low, muscles taut, her entire body humming with the silent urgency of someone who wasn't surprised, only finally allowed to act. Jack followed without hesitation, the boy close behind, and they reached a collapsed section of the mill floor, where the boards dipped into a sagging hollow filled with dirt, brick, and half-rotted insulation that stank of mildew and memory. Annie began pawing at the edge with both front legs, frantic but focused, as if she knew exactly where to dig, as if she'd always known but was waiting for the right eyes to witness what had been hidden too long beneath silence and fear. Jack dropped to his knees, ignoring the stiffness in his back and the wet cold soaking through his jeans, and helped clear away boards with bare hands, the dust choking, the splinters biting, but none of it slowing him down. Underneath, just beneath a cracked support beam, they found it, a narrow crawlspace, dark, shallow, barely the size of a bathtub. And inside it, curled up like someone trying to disappear from the world, was a boy. Thin. Bruised. Mute with shock. Eyes wide and empty like he'd stared at something too long and it had stared back. Caleb gasped. Ben. The name hit the air like thunder against the roof of a church, loud, sacred, unbelievable. The boy inside the crawlspace didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't even reach for them, he just stared at Annie, as if she were the only thing in this world he trusted not to hurt him. Jack pulled the kid out gently, slowly, whispering soft things that didn't matter. You're all right, we got you, you're safe now, because it wasn't about the words, it was about the way he said them, and the fact that someone was finally there. Caleb held his brother close, tears streaming down both cheeks, his mouth trembling too much for words, so he simply kept whispering the name, over and over, as if trying to breathe life back into him syllable by syllable. Jack looked at Annie, then back at the open window, where the man in the coat still stood, still watching. Except now, he was gone. The sedan remained, idling in the same spot, but the man had vanished. Jack's heart jumped. He turned in place, eyes scanning the darkness around them, every creak of the building now magnified into something terrifying. Annie bristled, her body tense again, but this time her nose pointed toward the ceiling, not the door. Jack looked up. Footsteps. Above them. Slow. Measured. Someone was already inside. He reached into his jacket and pulled the revolver free, the weight of it both foreign and familiar, like holding hands with an old sin. Back room, he whispered. Move. Caleb nodded and helped Ben to his feet, the boy barely walking, half dragged, half carried toward the rear of the mill, where a busted stairwell led to the rear fire exit and a narrow trail behind the ridge. Jack stayed behind with Annie, his body angled toward the doorway. Then he heard it, soft leather shoes against old wood, deliberate, close. And then the voice. Smooth. Calm. Measured like a man who never raised it unless it was too late to matter. She wasn't supposed to survive, you know. But she did. And she remembered. That's always been the problem with her. The man stepped into view at the far end of the hall, no gun in hand, no weapon visible, just a cold look and the kind of presence that made your skin feel too tight. Jack didn't lower the pistol. "You were at the quarry." The man smirked. "I was at a lot of places. Blackstone's just where it ended." Annie stood between them, tail down, shoulder tense, growling low. The man shook his head slowly, like a disappointed teacher. "You trained her too well. She was never supposed to bond like that. It made her unreliable." Jack stepped forward, voice steady despite the shaking in his hands. "So you left her in the woods, let her wander the damn country until someone took her in. She found you," the man said. "And now, she's brought it all back." In the distance, tires skidded over gravel. Someone was coming up the back road, fast. Jack raised the revolver a little higher. "You're not walking out of here." The man smiled faintly. "I never planned to." And then a crash, metal slamming against metal from the front entrance. A second vehicle. "Back up. More coming." Jack turned to Annie, voice low and urgent. "If you remember everything, then what the hell else have they done?" "Everything," Caleb said behind him, his voice dry and trembling, but clear, like someone who had finally stopped running from the truth. "They used her to find kids, then they used the kids for things I still don't understand." Jack didn't move. Not at first. Because there are some things a man doesn't react to immediately, things so dark and strange that they freeze the mind before the heart catches up. Outside, more tires skidded to a stop, too many doors opening, too many footsteps crunching gravel. Whoever these men were, they had come prepared for resistance. Jack turned to Annie, whose eyes had narrowed to slits, focused on the hallway behind them, her body rigid with that same stillness she showed the first night they met, only now, it wasn't grief she carried. It was purpose. They didn't speak. Not Jack, not Annie, not the boys huddled behind the crates in the back hallway. Because when the past breaks open all at once, it drowns the air, and all that's left is instinct. Then the first shot rang out. Not inside. From outside. A warning. Or maybe a signal. Jack pulled the boys close and motioned for Annie to take the lead through the rear hallway, past the rusted fire exit that led into the woods. They had less than a minute. As they crossed into the trees, Jack looked back once, just in time to see the man in the coat standing in the mill doorway, not chasing them, not shouting, just watching, like someone who'd known this ending was coming all along. They ran through brush and thorns, Annie guiding them with a precision Jack could hardly believe, cutting between tree lines, avoiding open spaces, always pausing just long enough to listen, like a compass that didn't point north, but toward survival. After nearly half a mile, they reached an old ranger cabin, forgotten, rotting, but still standing. Jack barricaded the doors with broken furniture while Caleb wrapped his brother in wool blankets, whispering gently as tears slipped down both their faces. Outside, the woods were too quiet. No shouting. No dogs. No sounds of pursuit. And that's when it hit Jack, they weren't being chased. They were being studied. He turned toward Annie, who sat by the door, unmoving. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't wanted to believe, not just intelligence, not just pain, but memory. And when he knelt beside her, resting his hand against her scarred neck, she nudged his chest gently, like a mother checking on her child before leaving the room. Caleb joined them by the fire, his voice shaking but steady. "I found a file," he said. "Months ago. Buried deep. Most of it redacted, but one section wasn't." Jack looked up. "What did it say?" Caleb hesitated, then answered, "They weren't just training dogs. They were testing children too. To see how far obedience could be pushed. To see who would forget, and who wouldn't." Jack felt the sickness rise in his chest like fire climbing a dry wall. He looked down at Annie again. She had remembered. Not just the boy. Not just the car. Not just the scent of the man who had taken him. She had remembered everything. Because she wasn't just trained to find. She had been trained to survive long enough to testify. That's what the man meant when he said she remembered too much. That's why she had wandered for so long, not running, not hiding, but waiting. Waiting for someone who would listen. Waiting for someone who would follow. Waiting for someone like Jack. From outside came the soft crunch of leaves, but this time it wasn't threatening, it was cautious, light. A patrol car. The local sheriff, called in by Caleb hours earlier. Jack stepped outside, shotgun still slung, and met the deputy in silence. It didn't take long to explain, at least the pieces they were ready to say out loud. Within the hour, more cars came. Not black sedans. Not silence and shadows. But real people. Authorities. News. The kind that couldn't be bribed or buried. The file went public. The names came out. Investigations opened. People who had been ghosts were pulled into light. And Annie. She didn't leave Jack's side. Not for the trial. Not for the interviews. Not even for the days when grief came back like a storm and Jack could barely lift his coffee cup. But she changed. Slept deeper. Watched less. Like something had settled inside her. Like she finally understood she had done what she was meant to do. One spring morning, a few months later, she walked out to the edge of the field behind Jack's house and lay beneath the old oak tree, the one his wife used to love. Jack found her there at dawn. Still. Quiet. Peaceful. He knelt beside her, resting his hand gently on her chest, and whispered, "You found him, girl. You brought him home. You did more than any of us ever could." Her eyes opened once. Just long enough to look at him. And then she closed them again. Jack sat with her until the sun was high, not speaking, not moving, because some goodbyes don't need words. That afternoon, he buried her under the oak, where the light stayed warm even on the coldest days. On the marker, he didn't write ranger. He didn't write shepherd. He wrote. She remembered. And because of her, so will we. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.